Let's talk a bit about the ancient Celts, one of those cultures in history about whom there is plenty of misinformation and myths and debates and a lot of uncertainty as well. So first off, the usual disclaimer, I'm not a historian, I don't claim to be an expert, I'm just giving you some information here that I've read up on myself, but I really want to encourage you to do your own research. You should never take anybody's word at face value, even if they are a historian, actually, because plenty of times historians have been dead wrong, especially on things like fighting techniques and martial arts in general, where they fall for the same myths as everybody else, really. So okay, I will link the sources that I've read recently down below. I've also read some other things. I can't remember everything, but I'm going to link what I do remember in the video description so you can check that out for yourself. Okay, so the topic is mainly Celts versus Romans. Why were the Celts defeated by the Romans? I mean, it's one of those idle questions that you can always ask. Why was such and such defeated by the Romans? Why were the Carthaginians defeated by the Romans? Why were the Greeks defeated, or the Etruscans, or the Samnites for that matter? I mean, undoubtedly the Roman military was a very efficient fighting machine. Everything about its funding and organization and the way it adapted to new challenges and all of that made it very effective. But oftentimes their enemies are downplayed. History is written by the victors, and Roman writers are infamous for their bias and sometimes downright slander against the cultures they encountered. So that needs to be taken into account when reading what they wrote. In some cases, we even have direct archaeological evidence that disproves what they said. For example, Julius Caesar claimed about the British Celts that they had no agriculture and were just living off meat and milk, while archaeology has shown that they had quite advanced agricultural technology. You also have to consider that we don't have extensive written sources by the Celts themselves. Now, from the later post-Roman conquest period, we have more material. So like old Irish texts, for example, with Celtic myths that are described, which most likely are based on an oral tradition reaching further back in time. But we also see some elements in those texts, the way that equipment is described, the material goods they had, that seems to really match more contemporary time periods rather than earlier ancient Celts. So again, there's not that much directly about, pre-conquest Celts. There isn't that much outside of a few cases of Romanized Celts writing about their background. But that, of course, makes everything a lot more difficult. The other thing is Celts are much more diverse than people generally think. We tend to think of the Celts as a homogeneous group, which they really weren't. I mean, we can tell by certain material styles and certain decorations which are Celtic, which are found in different regions, and of course the language connects them, but they ranged from British Celts to Celt-Iberians to Galatians in Anatolia, and there were some differences in material culture, and also they didn't actually see themselves as a united group, which is a very important reason, but I'll get to that later. So as far as the equipment is concerned, especially in the beginning, they weren't terribly different from the Romans. Early Republican Roman soldiers were relatively similar in equipment. In fact, there is some evidence that the Romans took the scutum from the Celts, because for one, there is the etymological evidence shows that scutum is most likely of Celtic origin. Some people have tried to trace it to Latin words, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and the Celtic origin seems more likely. Now, there is some debate. I've seen different statements about that. I don't know for sure if that really is true, but it is a possibility. And also other elements of the equipment. Mail armor, which the Romans called lorica hamata, was, according to Roman writers, invented by the Celts, and that is confirmed by the archaeological record, because we have finds of mail armor from the 3rd century in Latin graves. So they apparently came up with that. Also, the Roman helmet was based on a Gallic design. Now, as far as the swords are concerned, I wish I had a good, accurate reproduction of a Celtic sword, but they are really hard to find on the modern market. I mean, there's plenty of less accurate, quote-unquote, reproductions, but it's really hard to find a properly done Celtic iron sword. There's Patrick Barta at Temple, who makes them. I'm actually on his waiting list right now for a Celtic sword, but the waiting list is years long, so it's going to take a while. Regardless, supposedly the Celtic swords bent very easily and had to be straightened after striking. I think it was either Livy or Polybius who said that. I'm not quite sure. I'll annotate that. So this is probably a case of, well, some were like this and some were of better quality. Like, we should never assume that all the equipment was the same way. I mean, in case of Roman soldiers, you can get away with that more easily, because then you can assume, okay, the equipment, the swords and such were mass produced, so they were much more likely to be fairly uniform and consistent. Whereas in case of Celtic swordsmiths, it depended a lot on the individual skill and resources, so there may have been quite a lot of variation in quality. To give you 2 examples, one, Peter Connolly, a scholar of ancient history, wrote about a 2,000-year-old sword that it could bend double and flex back to straight. And then also I read a book by Mike Loades, who talked about a very accurate reproduction of a Celtic iron sword, which he tested, and he found that it did bend after several strikes, but it took definitely more than just one cut, and it was quick and easy to straighten out. I mean, if I compare that to a bronze sword, I did some abusive testing with this one here, and yes, it did bend and twist with hard use, but it was gradual. It definitely took several swings for that to happen, and it didn't deform dramatically. And that is bronze. Of course, it also depends on whether they were work hardened or quenched. Tempering, from what I've read, wasn't done until later. So it does seem likely that at least some of the blades were rather soft. But overall, the difference in equipment between Celts and Romans isn't that dramatic. I mean, the gap gets a little larger in later times. During Caesar's conquest of Gaul, the Roman equipment was a little more advanced, like the kind of armor that they had and the swords and such. So there was possibly a bit of an appreciable gap, but overall, I mean, they had helmets, shields, spears, swords, javelins. It's not like a dramatic difference. Although, to be fair, mail armor was rare among the Celts. It would only be chieftains and nobles who could afford it. Anyway, so then there is the idea of the whole, uncivilized barbarians who just rush into battle shouting and being all crazy, but really sucking at fighting, according to some Romans and all of that. So that also needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Oddly enough, some of the sources are contradictory. On the one hand, you have the image of the clueless barbarian, but then you also have accounts of more sophisticated fighting tactics. For example, Livy in a particular battle mentions that the Celts were raising their shields above their heads and locking them. Now that sounds a lot like a testudo, and in fact Julius Caesar says specifically about some Gauls that they were forming a testudo. And he also said about the Helvetii that they assumed a phalanx. Now, whether that is a real phalanx or something that vaguely resembles it or something that is more akin to later shield walls, who knows, but it is kind of interesting to see that. Livy also said that they were standing in close order behind their shield wall, so that really runs counter to the idea that the Celts just gathered in this huge masses and completely loose random formations and were just rushing at them and, not really knowing what they were doing. I mean, they couldn't have been too terrible on the battlefield. The Greeks respected Celtic fighting ability. They often used Celtic mercenaries. The Carthaginians used Celtic mercenaries. The Celts, of course, sacked Rome after the Battle of the Allia. They defeated 2 Macedonian armies in 279 BCE. So they had a lot of success. It's just, Rome at a certain point just steamrolled everything. That's kind of how it went. But probably the most essential factor to consider is societal organization. The Celts didn't have centralized power the way that Rome did. For one, they were all organized along separate groups. So it wasn't just the Celts or even just the Gauls. It was, the Belgae, the Arverni, the Aquitani, the Senones, the so on and so forth, the Gaisatae. And even though in some cases they did have a sense of shared cultural origin or a kinship, and they were in contact, they traded, and sometimes they helped each other out, and sometimes they formed alliances and all of that, fought together, but there wasn't this idea of unity. And sometimes they were in conflict with one another. I mean, Julius Caesar actually invaded Gaul on the, excuse basically that, oh yeah, I'm just going to help you out against your neighbors. So they were actually invited to help out with an internal conflict that 2 Gallic groups had. And so in some cases, it didn't really occur to them, it wasn't on the table, it wasn't an option to band together and form this confederation. It happened occasionally, but generally it just didn't occur to them that they could just, gather all their neighbors up and just band together against the invading Romans. And let's not forget that the Romans and Celts had different ideas about authority. A Gallic chieftain didn't have the power of life and death over his warriors, the way a centurion had over his legionaries. Celtic leaders had to earn their authority through charisma, through their ability to fight and lead and trade and otherwise maintain their status, which means that warriors could theoretically at any time say, screw this, not worth my time, I'm going home. Try that as a Roman soldier. There may also have been more of a focus in their martial training on single combat as opposed to fighting in formation. Now, some of the Roman sources seem to indicate that they were quite adept at advanced battlefield tactics, but at the same time they had a strong emphasis on dueling, man-to-man, single combat. Often on the day of battle, when the 2 armies met, a Celtic champion would actually come forth and start insulting the others and boast about his deeds and his ancestors and whatever, and would expect someone from the opposing army to come forth and meet his challenge. And then in some cases, the battle would be decided based on the outcome of that duel. Not always, but you can see this strong emphasis on personal honor and glory, and they may have had more of a focus on training for a dueling situation, which of course is completely different from fighting as a unit on a battlefield. Now that's just my personal speculation. I could be off on that, but yeah, this is really what I've read so far. If you want to do your own research about the Celts without running into a bunch of bogus which randomly has the name Celtic assigned to it, I would suggest looking up information about the Hallstatt culture, which is from 800 to either 500 or 450 BCE, and the later La Tène culture, which is either 400 or 450 to 15 BCE. So yeah, I hope you found the video interesting, and thanks for watching.